Hey, history buffs. Welcome back to the channel where we dive deep into history's most epic showdowns. Today we have a heavyweight battle. No, not a fight over who can drink more tea or coffee, but a battle of leadership during the most intense conflict of the 20th century, World War II. In one corner we have the bulldog of Britain, the man who could inspire a nation to stand strong no matter what. It's none other than Winston Churchill. And in the other corner we have the statesman who pulled America into the war, turning the tide with his indomitable will and political genius, Franklin D. Roosevelt. So who was more important? Who had the bigger impact? Who made the most difference in the fight against tyranny? Let's find out. Section 1. The men behind the leadership. Okay, let's break it down and talk about who these two men were before the war, because trust me, the way they lead is a reflection of what they brought to the table. Winston Churchill, a man with a voice that could rally nations and a mustache that could defeat armies. Seriously, if Churchill was alive today, he'd probably have his own reality TV show, something like The Churchill Diaries, One Man, One Cigar, and the Fate of the World. But back to history. Churchill wasn't just born a leader, he earned it through decades of serving in politics, military, and even as a writer. Before World War II, he had already been the Prime Minister of the UK, and he had a pretty colorful reputation, to say the least. He was the guy who fought in wars, wrote books, and somehow always made it back alive. He had 9 lives before it was cool. Now, Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR as we like to call him, was already a political powerhouse before the war, too. But here's the thing, Roosevelt was gracious, a true master of the presidential smile, and the let's work this out handshake. He wasn't just any politician, he was a transformative figure. Despite being struck by polio and becoming a wheelchair user, FDR showed the world that adversity doesn't define you. If anything, it made him more relatable. You try handling a world crisis while being stuck in a chair that isn't even electric. Section 2. Leadership in crisis. Okay, so both men were seasoned leaders, but when the war hit, that's where things got interesting. This was no ordinary crisis. It was the crisis of humanity. So who rose to the occasion? Let's start with Churchill. When Britain stood alone against Hitler's war machine, Churchill didn't just give speeches. He became the embodiment of British resistance. "We shall never surrender," he declared, and boy did he make sure the world believed it. Imagine having that much faith when the world was on fire. It wasn't just about military strategy for Churchill, it was about moral authority. His speeches were like weapons, wielding hope, defiance, and courage. When people were trembling at the thought of invasion, Churchill was like, put the kettle on, let's win this war. Now, on the flip side, Roosevelt didn't have to fight the war on his own doorstep, but what he did have to fight was the reluctance of the American people to enter the war. Isolationism was strong in the United States in the early years of World War II. The American public was like, yeah, we'll just watch from the sidelines, thanks. But FDR, with his calm yet persistent leadership, gradually steered the American public towards supporting the war effort. It was like convincing someone to finally get off the couch and start working out, but with global consequences. And when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's famous words, "A day which will live in infamy," became the rallying cry that led America into war. Instantly, the country was like, let's do this. And this was a pivotal moment. The world wasn't just talking about the military, it was talking about a unified force, the United States, that was ready to be the hammer to Hitler's anvil. Section 3. The power of diplomacy. Now let's talk about diplomacy, because let's be real, this wasn't just a war of bullets. This was a war of alliances, treaties, and negotiations. Who handled that better? Well, Churchill, as the leader of the British Empire, wasn't exactly in a position to dictate terms, but boy did he know how to talk the talk. He had a unique relationship with Roosevelt. The two men became close allies, and their partnership was one of the most powerful of the war. They were like the ultimate power couple. If the couple were world leaders and had to keep the planet from going to war, they communicated constantly, exchanging letters and visiting each other. Churchill once even called Roosevelt at 3 a.m. to ask for military support, and Roosevelt, ever the diplomat, was like, sure, no problem. On the other hand, FDR's diplomacy skills were key in managing the big picture. His relationship with Stalin, for instance, was complicated, but FDR managed to keep the Soviet Union on the team without it completely falling apart. Roosevelt was like the perfect party host, trying to make sure everyone got along while subtly successfully keeping them from getting into fistfights. But here's the thing, while Churchill had the sharp political edge and confidence, Roosevelt had the smooth moves in the international arena. If this was a dance-off, Roosevelt would be like the smooth salsa dancer, while Churchill would be over there breaking out some dramatic Shakespearean monologue mid-tango. Section 4. The battlefields. Alright, we've been talking about speeches and diplomacy, but let's get to the battlefields. How did these two men shape military strategy, and who deserves more credit? Churchill's strategy focused on holding off the Axis in Europe and Africa. He wasn't going to let the Germans waltz through his backyard without a fight. The Battle of Britain was his shining moment. Talk about grit. When it looked like Britain was going to fall, Churchill's refusal to surrender was the cornerstone of their defense. Plus, his decision to collaborate with the United States was absolutely crucial. The British Empire wasn't giving up without a fight, no matter what. Now, Roosevelt was the guy with the industrial power and military muscle. His two-front strategy, focusing on Europe and the Pacific, was a game changer. Roosevelt made the calls that ensured America's resources, like factories and manpower, were used effectively. The American military strength, particularly in D-Day and the Pacific Theater, was pivotal to the Allies' victory. Section 5. The legacy of Churchill and Roosevelt. Alright, let's take a step back and talk about the legacy of these two titans of history. Sure, they were both incredibly important during the war, but what happened after the war? Churchill, after leading Britain through the darkest days, became a symbol of resistance and resilience. Even after the war, he remained involved in British politics, and in 1951, he returned to power as Prime Minister. But let's be honest, he wasn't just a politician, he was a global icon. His role in the post-war world wasn't just about leading Britain, he was also one of the key figures who helped shape the post-war order. He delivered the famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946, warning the world about the rise of Soviet influence in Europe. And while Churchill didn't have as much success at home later on, his vision of a united Europe and his role in the early stages of the Cold War left an indelible mark on history. FDR, on the other hand, tragically didn't get to see the post-war world firsthand, as he passed away in 1945, just months before the war's end. But his impact didn't stop with his death. The United Nations, an institution he helped create, became a central force for diplomacy and peacekeeping worldwide. His New Deal policies also laid the foundation for America's economic recovery and long-term growth. Roosevelt's vision of an international order based on cooperation and democracy, where all nations could thrive, set the stage for the global landscape of the 20th century. It's no exaggeration to say that Roosevelt's leadership shaped the world's future, not just for his own country, but for countless nations across the globe. So whether it was Churchill's wartime speeches and post-war warnings, or Roosevelt's forward-thinking diplomacy and vision for a peaceful world, both leaders left a legacy that endures today. And that's why, even though both men are long gone, their decisions continue to echo through history. Conclusion, the verdict, alright folks, we've come to the moment of truth. Who was more important? Churchill or Roosevelt? Churchill, with his unwavering resolve, led Britain through its darkest hour. He rallied the British people with his powerful speeches and fierce determination. But it was Roosevelt who, with his vast resources, brought the United States into the war and provided the muscle that helped defeat Hitler and Japan. So who was more important? The answer isn't simple. Both men were essential to the Allied victory. But if we had to pick, I'd say it was Roosevelt's ability to unite and mobilize an entire nation, and then some, that tipped the scale. But hey, history is messy, and in the end, both of these men played key roles in one of the greatest victories in history. So what do you think? Who was more important, Churchill or Roosevelt? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more epic showdowns in history. Thanks for watching. Catch you in the next video.